This is the DRS train.
Bring back V10s? Screw that. Bring back W12s. I'm Peter Brook. I'm joined by Nedzo's F1 Gridbox and Josh Revel, and you're listening to the DRS Train podcast. So, amongst a lot of the kind of notoriously bad backmarker teams, there is one which oftentimes kind of goes under the radar because a lot of people know about Andrea Moda and all of their escapades and everything that went on with them. But Life F1 is a team that came to my knowledge relatively late in my viewing of Formula One. But to talk about them, we've brought back one of the doyens of historical F1 content, Josh Revel. And I think, like me, you would agree that, because I believe we both covered this team before on our own respective channels, it's something of a rite of passage for any historical F1 creator to talk about Life F1, isn't it?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, 100%. That and the whole Kimi Räikkönen bankrupting a team. They're pretty much the two videos that you have to create to affirmatively say, I'm an F1 content creator. So, yeah.
And Nedzo is appropriately dressed with his Scuderia Ferrari outfit for our discussion about we have Ferrari at home, in basically.
Yeah, so both teams are red, both teams are Italian, both teams are fairly incompetent. And I mean, especially nowadays, Ferrari in 2025 and Life in 1991, they both have one driver that's popular with the youngsters and one driver that whose prime was 10 years ago and is a bit washed up and past it.
But yeah, they're an interesting team because to give a little context of sort of the genesis and how they even came about, we've been used now for more than 10 years to having these very specific restrictions on engines. Everyone has to have the same kind of turbocharged hybrid V6. There are restrictions on the fuel flow rate and the RPM. Go back 30 years ago, that wasn't such a thing because we'd had for most of the 1980s turbo engines to cut costs and also to help with safety in many respects. They banned them at the end of 1988 and basically said you can have 3.5 litre engines in any configuration of your choice. And I think today we could only dream of being afforded such creativity and variety. And so Life F1 comes about because while everyone else is doing V8s, V10s, and V12s, which have all been used extensively and a well-trusted piece of machinery, they thought, let's try a W12, which is a very rare engine type. I mean, the Bugatti Veyron has a W16 as an example, but their enormous size doesn't really lend itself well to a Formula One car, but they kind of decided to give it a go anyway, and as we'll get into, it didn't really work out too well for them.
Yeah.
So you look like you're about to speak, and I was like, okay, he's going to talk. So.
Yeah. So basically, when Life came into Formula One, I'm pretty sure the idea was that I think the reason why they chose a W12 over anything was, I believe, packaging in terms of the engine bay, and also because of the center of gravity. I believe with the W12 is lower than it is with a V12 engine. So I believe that the guys who put it together, they did it for those reasons, and also because they'd found that I think race cars from the mid to late 1970s had a similar. They tried it with cars from the 70s, and apparently they were just better in those days. I don't get that because I don't believe any of the Ferraris from back in the day did have a flat 12, and obviously those were perfect for those reasons, center of gravity. It was only when the ground effect came in did they really start causing issues. So you could argue that's a good reason, but it wasn't the 1970s anymore. It was the 1990s, and you could argue that the car they ended up using may as well have competed in the 1970s because it still wouldn't have been competitive.
Yeah, pretty much. I don't really know what to add to this, other than I guess the origin of it was. I mean, it was the dream of. Oh my good lord! Who was the engine designer again?
Frank Chitti, I think.
Yep, and he was at Ferrari for a bit. He always sort of had that dream about the V12 engine. When it went away into retirement before eventually someone basically rekindled that dream and breathed new life into it. Get it? Life? Ha 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 ha. I'm not funny. But that was it. It was pretty much an old idea that was brought back into the modern age simply because these new regulations allowed for it. And despite all the potential, it just was the most horrific disaster that ever happened. It was somehow worse than the whole Subaru Coloni debacle.
Which itself was a flat 12 engine, which by this point was, as we've seen with Ferrari, a tried and tested machine that could work really well. But W configuration engines in general are used more often for aircraft than for cars. But this one, originally, the intention wasn't actually to have their own constructor. They were like, okay, we'll advertise this W12. We'll see if any teams are interested in having it, and we can be their engine supplier. None of them were. So like, okay, well, if we want to do this, I guess we've got to make our own one. And there was, in 1989, again, this kind of came about because of the ban of turbos and the becoming cheaper and more economical. There was a team called First Racing who were on the entry list for 1989, but they never raced, and they may have only tested, but they're a team I know relatively little about. But for whatever reason, they never turned up to a single race.
Basically, what happened with First Racing was, I can't remember what the name of the guy who ran the team was. I think that one of the main designers might have been, I think it was Gabriele Rumi, who had time with Brabham and a couple of other teams, and Fond Metal and other teams like that. And I think he came out as saying that the car would have been better as a flower pot than it would have been as a car. And so he said it wouldn't have been competitive in F3000, and so they built the car. And they just didn't get off the ground because instead of trying to push the issue and try and see if the car was good, they just didn't try at all because they knew it wasn't going to be good. And so Life bought that entry. It had failed crash tests when it was with Firsts, but for some reason, somehow it passed the crash tests when it was under the Life guys. So I don't know how they did that. I think initially during the manufacturing phase of the chassis, they'd made some issues with the body or something like that, and they'd injected it with some sort of, this is all coming back to me now, they'd injected it with some sort of like strengthening material, and so that although it strengthened it and made it maybe able to pass crash tests, it made it much heavier.
Didn't the designer also try extremely hard to either not have the car ever race or just so much as have his credentials taken away from it, because he wanted nothing to do with that car? Like, once he found out that Life had taken a hold of it and we're going to try and make it race, he tried as hard as he could to distance himself from his own creation. I remember there was a part in the whole researching process where he abhorred his own creation, and I was thinking, yeah, I understand you on that one, man. I've got a few videos that I have the same feelings over.
I wouldn't be surprised at that at all. I do believe that that's probably the most sensible thing to do. To sometimes you make a Frankenstein car that no one loves, and you have to just kind of put it to bed. And when someone decides to bring it back to life, maybe you're like, no, you don't do that.
There are a few examples of that happening around this time period because the regulations were so relatively unrestricted, and because it was for the time reasonably cheap to enter Formula One. You did get a lot of these kind of teams giving it a go. And one of the bigger examples is Lamborghini, because they created a car for Scuderia Modena, but they themselves wanted to distance as much as they could from it. But the thing is, that car could qualify, could start races, and almost scored points. So it wasn't the worst thing in the world. It just looked a bit funny because it was doing the no side pods thing before Mercedes, basically. But yeah, First Racing, it was Lamberto Leone who founded that as a F3000, a Formula 2 team. He himself was an ex-F1 driver. They were kind of okay in Formula 2, but then they just built this car that obviously wasn't any better for that. And I guess because no one wanted it, it's like, well, we'll have it because it's nice and cheap, and somehow we'll find a way of fitting a W12 inside, which they managed, because when you look at the car, it is a very strangely proportioned machine, because it has this quite like narrow cone-shaped nose cone that's very long, and this enormous bulging engine cover instead of one that just kind of gracefully slopes downwards. And I'm not to be honest, they didn't just do this. It wasn't just them that did this, but late 80s, early 90s, there's this obsession with having cables like attaching the wings to the car, and this one has them. And I don't know if that's a specific aero function or if the cars were just built so badly they thought that, well, if we don't do this, the wing's just going to fly off at high speed. But that as well does not lend itself to being a good look for this machine, I don't think.
Well, I mean, half the cars back then were Italian, and you got to remember what exactly the door handles were on an F40 Ferrari. it was string. So I wouldn't put it past them that they thought, structural integrity, all that good stuff. But
anyone who's seen their bridges known that engineering is not the Italians' strong suit. Yeah.
No, but it looks spectacular for the 5 seconds that it's up. No, but in terms of structural integrity, like, yeah, wires on the wings was, I don't think, did the rear wing ever come off on that car? I know stuff flew off of it, but did the rear wing ever come off on that car?
Not the rear wing.
Or was it only the engine cover?
The engine cover did. The rear wing never did. I mean, around that period, I'm trying to think of examples of that happening to anyone, because in most cases that would trigger a pretty big accident. But
Elio De Angelis.
In 86?
86, yeah, poor car. Rear wing came off.
That was that very low slung Brabham where they tilted the engine to actually, ironically enough, improve airflow to the rear wing.
There's also closer to this time, or not same distance, 1994, when Lotus were running on food stamps, their cars were brittle. They were so brittle. And I was reading Zanardi's book, and Pedro Lamy on the test day was just pestering like, I want to go. And I told Zanardi, get in here. Our checkbook wants to drive. And Zanardi's like, fine, get in. And he was praying. It's just like, I hope he has an accident. Seriously, I hate this guy. Comes around the next lap, rear wing snaps, and threw him under the underpass going to a bridge. And he was in the car going there. Sorry?
Silverstone, wasn't it?
Yep. Yeah. And he was in the car, like the course car, going to the crash. And Zanardi's just praying, I hope he's okay. It's like, whatever. And they went, the whole season, the car kept on falling apart. And he had to retire due to, I think it was an engine failure in Adelaide. And Zanardi's, very emotional guy. He was walking down the paddock, and his engineer said, are you upset that you retired from the race? He's like, yeah. He's like, come here, I want to show you something. Went to the rear wing. It was probably about that much on the rear wing that wasn't cracked. And they estimated about 2 more laps, it would have come off. Which, around that Adelaide street circuit, yeah. So, rear wings falling off, even into the 2000s, it wasn't that rare. You had Ralph Furman and James Courtney had massive accidents through rear wing failures. So, yeah, you can probably understand their apprehension to not having string on the rear wings.
It's quite shocking, really, and this is just a general point that 30 years ago, because but basically all of its history, Formula One has been the pinnacle of motorsport. And I understand that, we have, when it comes to safety features, that comes with time and just understanding and knowledge. But building a car that doesn't fall to pieces feels like a kind of a prerequisite when you're racing in Formula One, especially when they're built out of carbon fiber, which they had been since the early 1980s. Because you've got that issue, the cars just break apart alone from the forces of the air and the aerodynamics and whatnot. But also the reliability of engine failures constantly. And it's like, because in the past 2 to 3 seasons, we've finally got to a point where engine failures basically don't happen. And if they do, they have very little actual effect on your championship standing because they're so rare. But back then, it's like, how hard is it to build an engine that can run for 90 minutes without blowing up, or a gearbox that can survive it? And there's just it's just a general issue the sport had at that time, that there was only a handful of teams that could build cars that really worked properly. And Life is right at the bottom of that, because they've got this car which is just terrible in every way and obviously built on the cheap, and they're trying something new and it doesn't really work. Which makes it all the more shocking that they actually made it onto the entry list for 1990, because they got it approved. It's like, okay, well, I guess we're a team now, and they found this Italian businessman Ernesto Vita to basically form a team with it, and they took his surname of Vita, which means life, and it's like, I guess we'll just call ourselves Life now. But Italian businessman, late 80s F1, we can kind of connect the dots of what's probably going on and how he got his money, but I don't think he was quite as sketchy as Andrea Sassetti, but maybe not far off.
Well, he didn't get shot outside his own nightclub, so yeah, Sassetti set a high bar, that's for sure.
So then they made the entry list with this life racing engines, because again, the whole idea, I think, to be honest, they didn't care so much about the car itself and the chassis because they didn't build it, but also because it's like we want to try and showcase this engine and see if we can convince teams to take us on as a customer. But then he said it was really fun to drive because it drove like a go-kart, but then it would spin in a straight line and stuff like that.
Of course he said that.
Yeah, I almost said De Cesaris, but I was like, knowing De Cesaris, he probably drove for Coloni at one point, but I can't remember. But yeah, that was a Gasho one, and there's footage of him spinning like on the straight in Imola and everything, and that car is very wide, the Subaru. But yeah, so then they had to try and find drivers, and well, the Brabhams were kind of coming back as a name in F1 at this point because Jack Brabham had been long retired and had since sold the Brabham team. The team 5 years ago had been amazing. They'd kind of gone downhill. I mean, we did a podcast on them, and if you want to listen to that one, we'll have it linked in the corner. They missed out 88. They come back 89. So the team is still there, but they're hanging on by their last legs. But then Jack's sons are now old enough to enter Formula One, and they recruit Gary. This is before he kind of gained notoriety for other reasons, but yeah, it means he entered F1 at the same time as brother David, although David had a rather better go of it because he didn't have to endure this horrible life car.
Yeah, this is one poison chalice. Like, this is the one thing that I didn't want to do at any point on a podcast was, right, let's talk about Gary Brabham. Like, yikes. But yeah, I cannot for the life of me remember how much Gary paid or whether he was racing for free or how that came about. I know that there were a few drivers that they were in contact before, that they had initial agreements with before, and that Gary was quite a late addition to the team, if I'm remembering correctly. See, this is the problem when you don't revise research quite so quite enough before getting onto a podcast like this. I'm making a fool out of myself. But wasn't that the case where Gary was not the first choice, and in fact they actually had other ones with agreements that fell through?
I think that was the case. I think there was probably a couple of Italians, other than the one who came in later on, Bruno Giocamelli, but there were a couple of other Italians, and I believe that he had also been approached by, I believe it was Brabham. I think there was considerations of having both Gary and David in the same team or something of that nature. But that fell through, and so he kind of had no choice but to go to Life. Obviously, it was similar to, I think, what happened with Kovalainen and Trulli at the end of 2009. They had nowhere else to go, so they went to a backmarket team and just tried to hold it out for a couple of years. I think that's what it was. I mean, from memory, I think he did do some international F3000, I think some endurance racing as well, but that's about as far as his career went.
Yeah, this was kind of, he was a bit of a late addition to the team, Gary, because they fired someone called Franco Scapini as their test driver, who is not exactly a well-known name. I mean, he'd been racing in like Italian Formula 3 for several years before this and not doing much. But Gary he'd won British F3000 the year before, and he'd been racing in international F3000, so he'd actually been reasonably promising career-wise. I mean, it's hardly surprising with his name and the kind of money and backing he would have had. So it wasn't the worst prospect they could have had. But I can sense that, yeah, he probably was maybe unwilling to do this when he, I think, could have gotten away with going somewhere a bit better, if not joining his brother at their father's team.
Yeah, 100%. And I just briefly had a look to see who was under consideration. I'll bring it up now. This is me being an expert here. Gabriele Tarquini, Pierluigi Martini, Marco Apicella, Roberto Moreno, Gianni Morbidelli.
List of good drivers.
And good drivers, yeah. And out of that, Gary Brabham. But the thing is, it didn't matter who you put in that car. No one was going to do anything with it. Because, well, you know, as we'll find out, there was only so much that car was capable of. Right up until that first race at Phoenix. And I think, like, at no stage did it look like it was getting any better. It was just progressively horrible the entire existence, even with the new engine change.
So yeah, they got to the season that year began in Phoenix when they managed to resurrect the United States Grand Prix. At the time, Formula One had pre-qualifying because there were so many entries that you couldn't fit everyone on a 26 car grid. I mean, these days we have 20 cars, but there is room, other than at Monaco, maybe there is room for another 6 teams. And they certainly made the most use of that 30 years ago. So the backmarker teams like them and people like Coloni and Eurobrune and LaRousse, and for a period, Jordan had to do pre-qualifying, which was done very early on Friday, I think like 6 a.m. or something. And for a lot of them, they knew, well, 2 of us maybe are going to advance out of this into actual qualifying itself. But then even if we make it there, 4 people can't qualify for the race. So you have to cover that hurdle. So for a lot of those teams, it was just this, okay, we'll do pre-qualifying in a few laps and then that's the end of our weekend if we don't make it through. All of them except Life, apparently, it seemed had a reasonably good shot at it because they had this engine and they're like, oh, well, this is going to be plenty powerful. And then they end up 34 seconds off the pace, so slower than an F3000 car. And you're just like, how exactly? Because F3000 back then is the equivalent of Formula 2 today, and the gap is about 10 seconds per lap, roughly modern day, something like that. Depends on the circuit. But to be that much slower, because the thing is that W12 made about 450 horsepower compared to 700 for people like McLaren. How they did that, I don't know, because it must have just been very, very poorly engineered, because you have like pre-war Grand Prix cars and sports cars that did Le Mans in the 20s and 30s, and they've got like 6-7 litre engines that made 150 horsepower. And you're like, that is an extremely inefficient use of power and engineering. And something like that, a W12, it really should have had probably more than double the power it was putting out.
Yeah, Italian engineering, I think, is the way we can describe that. Italian engineering, and it was, as I said earlier, it wasn't just the power; it was the weight. And for 34 seconds off at a track like Phoenix, from memory, that track was about 90 seconds long. I might be slightly off on that requirement, because to be fair, they changed the layout of that circuit every single year it was on the F1 calendar, so it may as well have been at whatever circuit you wanted it to be. It was just, yeah. It definitely wasn't great at all. Obviously, Gary Brabham was a rookie. The team was completely new. Maybe you could shave off a few seconds because of that, but you can see where the flaws for the car start instantly coming in. There's no power, there's no grip, and yeah, I don't even know, what were they running? Pirelli tires, I'm guessing, because there was a lot of Italian teams back that used those Pirelli tires.
More than likely.
Yes.
It was. I think at the time it was basically compulsory for Italian teams to use Pirelli tires, because they came back. They were there until 86, and then they came back in 89, and then left again in 91. But also, basically, aside from the 1950s, Pirelli only catered to backmarker teams, and they had the odd excursion with Lotus and Brabham, which didn't work. But otherwise, it was like Ozella and Eurobrune and kind of little teams like Tolman, of course, as well, until Senna convinced them to switch over to Michelin. So it would have been Pirelli. But a lot of the pictures, it has like treaded tires or grooved at points as well, which is interesting. But it just doesn't really look like a Formula One car, because I described how the shape of it and everything. It looks kind of, even though it's got this massive engine, it looks kind of small at the same time. But even so, this is a similar thing which I'm kind of wondering about, because like Andrea Moda, they didn't seem to struggle to get sponsors. Because the livery looks like a Ferrari because it's red, but it's got a reasonable amount of sponsors on it, considering the team. And so, how they got those? They're probably quite cheap sponsors, but they didn't seem to struggle in that area, which is kind of surprising.
Well, it could be a case like it is with lower ranks formulas, where basically, oil sponsors or tire sponsors or whatever, there could be a quid pro quo of, we'll give you free such and such for space on our car. It could be stuff like that, but also Ernesto Vita was a businessman, right? Well, typically very astute, knows how to strike a deal, all that stuff. We see that sometimes with some of the worst drivers on the grid, and you just think, how the hell do you get money to race? That's how they get racing in the first place, because they know how to strike a deal. I've known a few damn good racing drivers on this side of the globe who, they couldn't sell a damn thing. They couldn't sell themselves to a mirror, and they never went racing as a result of that.
Yeah, I think this is the era where there weren't many restrictions on sponsorship. Like, I'm not sure if they had any tobacco sponsors or any of those kind of ways, but you got that. But this was back when Ligier was being propped up by the French government. This is when a lot of teams, like probably 80% of the teams, were bankrolled by cigarette companies and cigarette sponsors. So, there's also the fact that although they started the season with quite a few sponsors, as you progress through the year, they start vanishing. Just the same with Andrea Moda.
Okay, so looking at this, they actually had Goodyear tires, so that's interesting. Yeah. So they got the decent tires. Sponsors wise, we've got Albini and Fontenot. No idea what that is. Agip, however you say it. That's the fuel.
Yeah.
PIC USSR. Okay, so they were being sponsored by the Soviets.
That's right. Yes, they were sponsored by. Hang on. No. That USSR one. That was an investor that came in and saved their ass midway through the season by promising this massive injection of money. But as far as I'm aware, that guy never paid them.
A tale as old as time.
Am I remembering that right?
That would sound about right.
No money from the Soviet bloc. That's never happened before. This is a very, very odd thing, along with, obviously an Italian team not running Pirellis. This probably is why the team failed. The Italian gods conspired against this team because they would not run Pirelli tires. This is your punishment for not being obscenely Italian.
I mean, it would have saved a lot of money to have the Pirelli tires as well, because they were cheaper and just, not as good. Although I don't think the tires were not the problem with this car, so I don't think it would have made a huge amount of difference. But they had a couple of sponsors like that. I mean, the USSR Raid was another one. I'm assuming not Raid Shadow. Yes, Raid Shadow Legends for Sega Mega Drive. What's this one on the wing? Marco Sorelli, I think it says. Yeah, so that's probably some fashion brand because Italy. But either way, they got a few, not as many as Andrea Moda, but still a few sponsors. It's not just a McLaren 2017 where there's nothing on it, or Sauber 2010 where it was blank and then they got fucking Burger King to sponsor them or whatever. So they managed to get something.
Chelsea, Oh no, that was 2012. My bad.
2012 when they had Chelsea. It's weird because it's like those are companies which are sort of above sponsorship because everyone knows who they are already. It's like you pick one of the ones. You pick one of the ones like White Castle or Wendy's or whatever, the fast food chain's less well known, or some shitey team in like Conference League or whatever. I don't know. Not Chelsea. They don't need the sponsorship, but they'll give you plenty of money, I suppose, if they feel like it, which they Sauber needed. But then, anyway, you could almost. The thing is that the entire team, a lot of it was because the engine guy was from Ferrari. The man who sort of, he didn't build the car technically, but modified it to make it just about roadworthy, was from Ferrari as well. So it's almost a Ferrari B team or a sort of off of that mark, but not that they would have wanted to associate, because these are all people who were fired by Ferrari, and I think for good reason.
I think you could say Ferrari rejects is probably the best way. The Formula E of Ferrari.
Yes.
It reminds me of the in the early 60s, Enzo Ferrari and his wife. I think his wife was being very trying to be very involved with the team and trying to push engineers beyond their limit. And so a lot of team members, including Phil Hill, who was one of the drivers at the time, left to join a rebel kind of operation called ATS.
ATS, yeah.
Yes, and
was it ATS or AGS?
No, it was ATS. AGS was in the 80s. It was French.
ATS was that German team. Well, that German team from 1970 something.
There are two ATSs, aren't there? And then there's the French it's like Automobile Jean-Freinet Sportif or whatever.
Yes.
The acronyms.
There's an that's the thing. There's the Italian and the German ATSs. There's two of them.
Yes.
Wasn't there a South African one as well?
No, that was LDS. That was London.
LDS.
No, that was Louis Duryea Special, I think.
Right. Ugh. Yeah. It's like having three different Lotuses. Team Lotus, and Lotus Kart Racing. Like, just
Lotus F1.
Yeah.
Lotus
Yeah.
Renault. Do we want to keep on going?
They just but they so it was an offshoot of that. And yeah, people that had been that weren't. What's his name? The one that was there for years and did the one who made the Foggieri. Yeah, they weren't him.
Foggieri, yeah.
Yeah, so just weren't really up to scratch because the guy, the man who built this W12, he first in the 60s he'd been trying like a W3, which
of course he was.
why on what platform? That's one per thing. That sounds extremely unbalanced. Like I don't know how that would really. I mean, anything that's odd that when it's odd numbered, you're going to have some. That's any engine that's like that is going to be very unbalanced.
Or are you working in an economical city car rather than an F1 car?
Yeah, something that has like 10 horsepower or whatever. Yeah, but he tried these kind of things, and it kind of sounds to me like Ferrari just let him go because he was some kind of mad scientist, like dabbling in the dark arts and all the restricted set stuff or whatever to do that. But yeah, I imagine they may have been surprised to be so slow at the first race, 34 seconds off, because that's even with that reduction in power, it's not like you get to a point after a few hundred horsepower where it's not so linear in terms of the speed relative to the power. The more power you gain, the speed doesn't necessarily go up with it, because it's like the difference between 500 and 1000 is not as big as you'd think it would be. But with this, it obviously was enough to mean that in the modern translation, it would give it the speed of like a Formula 4 car against Formula 1 to be 30 seconds off.
I think if you gave the Williams or the McLaren from that era a 400 horsepower engine, they probably get up to about 160, 170 miles an hour tops. I think that'd be about go.
Yeah, which for the most part is fine, but not so good at Hockenheim or Monza or Paul Ricard or any of those ones. Yeah. But they did, yeah. Sorry?
What was the race after Phoenix?
It was Brazil.
Interlagos. So another long straight. How were they in that one?
A little bit better with this one, although that being said, I think they sent the car out without any oil in it, unless that was Andrea Moda.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that was Andrea Moda. This time, no, he didn't set a time. So, yeah. And then basically just gave up after that. Yeah, on the outlap, connecting rod broke. So no time set at all. And this was when, like, because, I mean, even like Coloni and Eurobrune were like 10, 15 seconds off themselves. And so it's like, if they got a couple, it might have been able to beat them if they managed to get it moving, but obviously not.
And I think, am I right in saying this was the last appearance of
Gary?
Gary?
At this point, he was like, yeah, no thanks, and walked.
Yeah.
And that was all he did in Formula One. He never got any chances in teams. Whereas David he did his stint with Brabham themselves, and then he had his famous stint with Simtech, and he'd even been offered, I think, 95. He was going to do a second year with them, but then he'd already signed a deal to do touring cars instead. So he might have done something, and I think he won Le Mans as well. So he was no slouch, but his brother, it just didn't happen.
I'm not going to lie though. If I had signed a touring car drive and I was offered a Formula One drive, I'll be tearing that first contract up like I was trying to tear up the actual circuit. Come on, there's no way that you're going to, unless the touring car drive is like the best team on the grid and you're guaranteed to win a touring car title. Surely you've got to go for the Formula One seat, even if it is like a Simtech which you're going to do absolutely nothing in. Or maybe he just felt that car or that team was cursed because of what happened to Ratzenberger. I don't know.
I mean, in hindsight, it was the right decision because Simtech folded 4 races into 1995 anyway.
Yeah.
Maybe there's also the question of, there's also the question of, like, how much was he being paid to do touring cars?
Yeah.
Or how much he would have to pay to race for Simtech? Like, put it to you this way. What would you rather take? Having to pay $500,000 to race in a back market team that had no chance, or get paid $500,000 to race in a top touring car team, which back in those times, the Renault cars had Williams connections at the time. Like, I'm not saying that there would have been definitive shot or whatever. But sometimes you would rather take that $1 million swing and a chance at getting a championship title, which makes other opportunities way better, versus going into a back market team, which is kind of the mentality that Alex Palou has nowadays, where it's like, well, I stay here winning all this stuff in IndyCar, builds my portfolio, I earn loads and loads and loads and loads and loads of money every year, versus going into a back market team where I've got maybe half a chance that someone one day will, take a chance on me. It's like, it's important what car you have in Formula One. And as we kept on saying before, no matter who you put in that life car, they were not going to do anything with it because there was nothing to work with. And like that Phoenix track, that aforementioned Phoenix track, that was a very stop-start circuit, especially in the 1990 configuration. There was like, I believe it was pretty much exclusively 90-degree corners, with the exception of the last corner, which was sort of shaped like a triangle. But so much of it was, 90-degree left, 90-degree right. The 1991 iteration had a sort of new hairpin, which gave it a little bit more variety. But, it wasn't a massive speed track, that wasn't. So, but then they get to Interlagos, which was, pretty speedy, and things didn't get much better from there. Like, yeah, they were doomed from the get-go.
Yeah, I mean, the connecting rod breaking on your outlap is just similar to Andrea Moda. That's just negligence on the part of the mechanic, if anything else. Because otherwise, maybe it would have been okay at that circuit because it's more flowing. Because the two configurations of Phoenix, the second one, I think they had the triangle, but it had a small, slightly wiggly section. But otherwise, it's just city streets in a downtown metropolitan area, so it's going to be 90-degree turns. Nothing like that at Interlagos, but they never really got a chance to demonstrate that. The funny thing is, though, because Gary never raced in Formula One again, is that him and David, it was the same year, but they never actually were at the same weekend, because he left after 2 races, but then David didn't join until the 3rd round, so they never actually overlapped in the end.
Shame.
And
then, so is it San Marino next, the Imola Grand Prix?
Imola, yeah.
Was this Bruno Giacomelli?
Yes.
Bruno Giacomelli comes in, a guy who's not been racing since 1983, when he was with Alfa Romeo racing alongside, I think it was Mauro Baldi or Andrea De Cesaris. It might have been De Cesaris. And I think this was the race where, in qualifying, their fastest time, the car broke down halfway through the lap, got put on the back of a tow truck, and the tow truck went around the track, and the transponder picked the car up as it came back into the pits, and it set a 7-minute lap time.
That would explain a lot, to be honest, because otherwise I was like, how do you set a 7-minute lap time? If that's why, that makes a lot of sense. Because my first thought was, okay, well, the car must have stopped for 5 minutes or something otherwise, because 7 minutes around a circuit like that is, well, literally like 30 miles an hour, probably, if that. So, that would make sense.
Well, he said, like Bruno said, he was terrified on that lap that he was doing because that car was going so slow. He was petrified that someone was going to hit him up the backside, and he was relieved when the thing broke down because it's like, good, I don't have to drive this thing anymore. And it was sad because this was his chance back in Formula One where he was good in that Alpha. I'm not saying he was the next best thing, but he did all right there. Probably a bit unceremoniously dumped out of the world of Formula One. Then he came in and he sort of had this real want to prove that the W12 could work. He seemed to like the idea. He liked the whole concept of the team and what it was founded on. I remember he was enthusiastic. Then he got into the car. He's like, oh, no. It's like, it was a very quick realization that, this is quite a lot to work with. But even until the bitter end, he was still trying to make things work, even, when the pace stops coming in.
Giocamelli was a good driver. He got pole position at the 1980, the last race at Watkins Glen, the 1980 United States Grand Prix, and then got a podium at Caesar's Palace for next year. So maybe he just had affinity for American circuits. But As I said, I think by that point he was pretty, not washed up is the wrong word, but he was 38 years old, which by that time, unless you were like a generational talent, you didn't stay until you were 38. Like the only people who really did that was like Prost, Senna would have done, Mansell did, and I think Jacques Lafitte had just retired a couple of years earlier. He was like 43 when he retired. But apart from that, you didn't really see drivers go to the same ages that you do now. But you're pretty much finished by the time you were 35 if you weren't like a generational talent or a champion.
I mean, the average age. Well, the average age is kind of going up. Ironically, now if you think that Alonso is still driving reasonably well at 43, and
yes,
Lewis is 40, and he's gone off the cliff a bit, but still not that much in the end.
Are we forgetting the obvious one here? Sonny?
Oh yes, yeah.
Going
yes,
around at 60, that bugger can still drive.
I mean,
Just tested for McLaren.
I'm sure that all Aston Martin need to do to fix all their problems is just bring back Martin Brundle. That'll definitely sort them out.
What's wrong with the nepotism? It works.
No, because Brundle would come in and he'd talk about the Aston Martin upgrades. He'd go, "These upgrades are a day late and $1 short."
It would, yeah.
And actually, it would be a good homecoming because didn't Brundle race for Jordan?
Yes, he did in his last
exactly.
season.
So yeah, it comes back and fixes them. I mean, I haven't seen the film, but I'm spoiling it slightly, I guess, for people. I'm seeing it in a few days, but I kind of got the gist of what's going on. But yeah, 60. I mean, there's never the
electric boogaloo.
Yeah. the oldest driver in F1 history was 55, 56, Louis Chiron, and that was in the 1950s as well.
Yeah. So here's the thing, getting off topic here, but he was the oldest one to enter a Formula One race in 1955, and he didn't qualify for that race. And Javier Bardem, in one of the exclusive clips that came out, he's like, Louis Chiron won the Monaco Grand Prix at 58. I was thinking, no, he didn't.
He was early 30s when he won it.
He was 31, 32 when he won the Monaco Grand Prix. And like he didn't even race when he was 58. It was 57, I believe he was, in the 55 Monaco Grand Prix.
I think he was 58.
Well, it's only a year. Hang on.
That's where they maybe need a
only a year. That's why that's why Gary Brabham ended up where he is. But no, like,
yeah,
it is a ridiculous concept. The whole 60-year-old thing being in a Formula One car, and we know it's ridiculous because the idea that the 38-year-old could come in and turn around a team was ridiculous back then with life in Giocamelli.
This is why maybe they needed an advisor and consultant other than Lewis. Did Senna drive for Tolman Hamilton? Yeah. But,
Hamilton.
But yeah, 38-year-old. I mean, there was a sense of optimism. And to be honest, when they got to Monaco, it did improve because he managed to set 7 laps in pre-qualifying without the car braking.
Wow.
And it was only 2 seconds off the Coloni. So that's something. I mean, admittedly, the Coloni itself was 6 seconds off the next car, which was Claudio Langes in his Eurobrune. But that's a start. It completed a lap and didn't die, and it was only 14 seconds off the fastest pre-qualifier. He went for a second stint, and then the engine did fail on the outlap. But at that point, you're like, well, we're not going to qualify anytime soon, but we might at least be more or less keep on pace, maybe.
Maybe
It's a Monaco thing because again, Andrea Moda, they qualify. Maybe these slow cars just are better at slow circuits.
I think it's partly because the track is more driver dependent, and people like Moreno and Giocamelli were decent drivers, and also the fact that, like as I said, like the crap engines would be more mitigated. I know the chassis was also awful, but there's a way you can drive around the issues at Monaco that you can't on any other circuit. And yeah, maybe you could even argue that having less horsepower is better around Monaco.
I mean, nobody's getting above 160 anyway, and that's as fast as their car could go at Monaco. So yeah. So yeah, they did that. Monaco came and went, and I guess they're thinking, well, we're making since the car it can work for a little bit, and it was a similar story actually in Canada, because here they were 3 seconds off the Eurobrune, and then 6 seconds off the Coloni. But again, they did another 7-lap stint. But I think also this was when he was trying to tempt them away from their own engine design, because they had conversations with some of the teams running Judds to see if we could get one of those instead. In no other context would having a Judd engine be an upgrade. They were not good ones. It was just sort of like we have the Cosworth DFV at home kind of thing, getting a Judd V8, and it just makes me think of the there's a very good of the Simpsons. You got the Judd. I like that one. And there's also another, where's the heart? Another Simpsons engine meme that is quite good for the time. But yeah, he tried to convince them to put a Judd in it, and they didn't. And so he does another, goes out, and they're still slowest.
Wow.
But also Canada is a very different circuit from Monaco because it has that enormous long straight. Although this might have been the period when they had that wiggly chicane in the middle of it, or two of them. But even so, yeah, not really a circuit that shares that much in common with Monaco at the end of the day.
Yeah.
Yeah. They went backwards then, because next was Mexico. So enormous long straight, very fast circuit. Time of 4 minutes and 7 seconds. So clearly, yeah, engine died on the outlap.
Yeah.
The thing is, I'm assuming with this one that they must have put it on a tow truck. Because it was on the outlap when the engine died. So I don't know how, because otherwise a 4-minute lap time is, going around like 30, 40 miles an hour.
Yeah. Mexico's also a track that does exacerbate any reliability issues because thin air, not much air getting to the engine, all that sort of stuff because of the altitude. And also, can you imagine going through the Peraltada in that car? Yeah, no thanks.
Well, it would have been so slow that it probably would have been not too bad for it, to be honest. I mean, yeah. It would have been one of the few times you would have felt the G-forces in a car like that. But because he mentioned about San Marino being terrified, this is a circuit as well, and the same with Hockenheim when there was a speed difference of like 40 miles an hour with other cars. And it's like, I can see why that would be quite intimidating in a car that as well is not particularly well constructed. Yeah. But they were still, at this point, they were still continuing discussions about getting Judd engines, but it was still running into stumbling blocks in that regard. But even that, the gap, because so they were 2 minutes and 42 seconds off the pace. The next slowest car was the Eurobrune again, was 15 seconds off, but the others were all within 3 seconds. So the other pre-qualifiers were kind of there or thereabouts, and it was just the Eurobrune and the Life that really weren't working. I think Colonia, I don't know if they'd switched over that flat 12 yet, but yeah. It just wasn't happening at all.
There's not really much we can add to this. It's just an onslaught of. I was going to say an onslaught of mid, but it's not even mid. It's just an onslaught of utter rubbish.
Not much happening.
There's
not much happening. It's just like it goes out of the garage. It dies within sight of the garage, gets on the tow truck and comes back around, which probably was going to end up making the lap faster than what it was if it was under its own steam. It was just again. What can you add to it? There's not much to add upon what you've already just said here.
It's hard. I feel like because sometimes there is on YouTube you can find footage of some of the quali laps and the car being worked on in the garage and that. But I'm like, I get that they were let go, but these are ex-Ferrari engineers. They really should know what they're. Even if it's not a very powerful engine, it should be able to run for 10 minutes. And who are the engineers? Because I get that with and the mechanics. Because I get that with Andrea Moda, they just took the guys from his shoe factory and some students from the University of Perugia or whatever. But with this, what? How can you not build an engine that can run for just 15 minutes, even if it's going to be crap? Why is it? It's just braking as soon as you leave the pit lane.
I think we should just play the Italian national anthem to be able to answer that question.
Because I want to know. I don't know.
Yeah, sorry. You got to remember where Ferrari were in 72, 73, and where they were a couple years after that, and it all came down to organization and direction. And you can have a bunch of really damn good engineers on your side, but if you don't know how to guide them, how to tell them what to do properly, you got a dysfunctional relationship between the two, you're never going to get anywhere. Really, I think it goes without saying, I guess. But all of us know where that Ferrari team were in 72, 73. They were looking for any answer that they could. Any answer that they could, because they had Chris Amon, who was a damn good test driver, a damn good racing driver, and he couldn't make sense of them. And, brought in the likes of Lauda, who, helped steer them in the right direction. There were a few things going on at that time, but eventually they found their way. So, yeah, a few Ferrari engineers, great, but, at a new team like what they were, like, it's all very well and good saying that you got some ingredients together, but, even a good chassis couldn't shave Andrea Moda, for sure. So, yeah, inexperience on the part of the management probably conspired against them.
I mean, I do wonder if they'd managed to fit any testing in. I'm guessing not, because Andrea Moda did one test at a go-kart track. But with this, if otherwise, it's like, okay, every 2 weeks we show up, we run the car, it dies after 2 minutes, and then we go home and do nothing for 2 weeks. It's like, well, it's no wonder you're not making any progress then, really.
And then again, they also didn't have much money to be able to have that advantage to go and do some testing. That's the only issue. And onto the Ferrari point, I think it was management mostly, but it was also the drivers they had. Like, although they had guys like Ickx and Amon who were good drivers, I suppose Regazzoni and Lauda, as you said, did sort of things out, and Scheckter did sort of things out as well. But after that, like, they had some very fantastic drivers, people like Villeneuve, Pironi. Villeneuve's overrated anyway, but Pironi, but they're not fully like championship level drivers. Like Arnoux and Tombe, perfect example. They won the Constructors' Championship in '83, but they couldn't get anywhere near Prost or Piquet because they just weren't on that level.
Or question, just for argument's sake, they had Amon, but who was the other driver that was sort of spearheading Ferrari at that time? It was Mazzario, wasn't it?
Yes.
And
he made his own team.
The greatest of respect to that freaking cowboy-headed, Sergio Leone wannabe. Like, you had the drivers around at that time, and Mazzario was the guy that Enzo entrusted with spearheading the prancing Hans. Like, yeah. But, you were talking also briefly about that time of, you get to go into the 80s of the drivers. Like, 83, if in 83, Villeneuve and Pironi didn't have their fates the year before, was that 83 car going to win the championship?
They could have done. I think Pironi could have challenged.
Because Arnoux and Tombe were pretty freaking good. No, Tombe probably was not so much, but Arnoux could qualify a car.
Yeah. Arnoux was a good qualifier. That was about it, though. That's the problem. I think had Prost or Piquet been in that car, they could have definitely won the title. It's the same as like what we've got with Verstappen and McLaren nowadays, where if you put Verstappen, Russell, Leclerc in that McLaren, they're going to dance away to the title. It's not even going to be close. But that's just how Ferrari were going. And I mean, that's kind of what it was like with life. They had a lot of good parts, but then they just had a lot of bad parts as well. They had Giocamelli, who I think, although he was past it and he was a bit stinky, he would have been maybe like a second off of like the at maximum off of guys like Gasho, like the other guys in the small teams like Pierluigi Martini, Tarquini, those kind of guys. Maybe at maximum a second even, maybe even only half a second slower than those guys over a course of a lap. It's just that the chassis and the engine was utterly awful. Like, I know we're going to get to the point where they put the Judd in, but it's not like it resurrected like 10 seconds of pace.
And it didn't improve once they got themselves to France for Paul Ricard, because then this time it didn't even leave the pits at all. The engine just didn't want to start, so no time set there. But then Coloni at least were having they did their own 4-minute lap time because they had again engine failure on the out laps. But the rest of them were all within 5 seconds of one another.
Can you imagine if that happened on F1? By the way, can you imagine if Alpine turned up to a race and just did had like a 4-minute lap time in qualifying and just didn't compete? Can you imagine this kind of the meltdown that F1 Twitter would have? Or if we had like 10 extra teams and you're let's say Van Amersfoort Racing from Formula 2 comes into F1 and you're just like, why can't Richard Verschoor set a lap time? Because his engine doesn't start.
Well, I mean, with those Mechachromes, I wouldn't put it past them, to be honest. But yeah, it's like you may as well just enter the F2 car, and it's going to be faster than if you try and build your own thing and it ends up like this. But they had Silverstone was a little bit better because they did actually manage to run a few laps. Well, they did five laps, electrical failure, 15.5 seconds off the pace, and then 6 seconds off the Coloni. So, and that again, Silverstone is another high-speed circuit. And this is before they added a lot of the modern chicanes and hairpins and everything.
Yeah.
And it was, broadly speaking, still the perimeter road.
I think the only chicane they had was before Woodcut, the corner where Scheckter crashed in '73. I think they had a chicane there.
Yeah.
And I think that was it. They hadn't they hadn't added Maggots and Beckett's yet. They hadn't added the Titan Stowe or any of the Vale or Club sections.
Or Brooklands and Luffield, which has since been destroyed, actually, because they built a kart circuit over that part of the track. So that section,
I destroyed the bridge section.
Yeah, or it's been incorporated into this new karting circuit. I
walked on that circuit when I was at Silverstone 2 years ago.
I did in 2011. I walked on it. So yeah, that bit's obviously never coming back. But hey, at this point, they said that they failed to try and get the Judd engines. They were going to have to stick it out with the W12. But basically, because they didn't have the money to buy the Judds. I was like, well, the thing is, most people, half the teams just got this for free at that point, so I'm surprised they couldn't really afford that.
Could have gone to Honda and said, give us Satoru Nakajima.
Just get him and we'll get our free engines, yeah. But then it happens, then Hockenheim, again, another high-speed power circuit, 25 seconds off the pace, 20 seconds off of Eurobrunn. So yeah, that's the circuit where the top speed is really going to. If you're 30, 40 miles an hour slower, there's no possible way you can make gains into other cars there.
Yeah, I mean, what can I say other than just being in that car at that track would have been the scariest damn thing of all time because you're just a sitting duck. Like that was just a scream through the forest then, and. There was at least 2 chicanes then. Was there the chicane at the top end of the circuit at that point?
I believe so, yeah.
Just a straight up sweeper.
I believe the last chicane was added in '82, I believe, after maybe Depayet's crash. I believe they did have
wasn't the Ostkurve was the last one, and that's the one right the
Ostkurve was one at the top end of the circuit, and that was where Piquet and Salazar had their boxing match.
So it must have been added by that point.
Yeah, but it changed. Yeah. It changed slightly over the years. No. Three chicanes. Yeah, but apart from that, that would have been scary in that car.
If you're on my qualifying lap in that life, do you just not go on the racing line? Do you just sit on the opposite side of the way you should be on the track on the straight so that you don't get hit?
I mean, the thing is, you would have had plenty of warning when cars were coming because of the straights. Yeah, you'd hear them, you'd see them, and even in the stadium section, the speed difference wouldn't have been so severe. So you probably, you could have just run off the racing line very easily, and that. I'd love to see if there's footage of it in Hockenheim though, because there's some footage. There's footage of it being overtaken in Canada, I think. That I haven't seen much else of it. They did that. Then they go to Hungary, completely different circuit, all about downforce, and all of that. And this time, 19 seconds off. They made 5 laps, and then the engine died. 20 seconds off the fastest time, 15 seconds off the Eurobrunn. But this is a circuit where power is less important. It's all about cornering and short bursts of speed and everything, but still no better. No. Spa, goodness me. That's again, another 5 laps and then an electrical failure.
I can see a theme developing here.
Yeah, and at this point they were trying to resurrect the idea of getting a Judd engine in. So now he was 21 seconds off the fastest time, and he was 17 or 18 seconds off the Eurobrunn. So by this point, Coloni and Eurobrunn had sorted themselves out, and they got themselves within 2 to 3 seconds of Ozella, and this was the midway point of the season. So because Lola, which would have been Larousse, had graduated to actual qualifying and didn't have to do pre-qualifying anymore. I think it was after Brabham was still there. There was someone that would have pulled out that would have created that vacancy to just move straight up. Who I can't remember, but yeah.
In 1990.
Leighton
maybe
House?
Zach Speed?
maybe it's actually because mid-season they do swaps. They would like if any of the pre-qualifiers scored points or did well, they would just swap them out with someone who hadn't. But either way, it was Azella, Coloni, AGS, and Eurobrune, and then Life were now the ones doing it because Andrea Moda managed to avoid pre-qualifying after Brabham pulled out in '92 because there weren't enough teams to warrant it anymore. Monza, yep, high speed. It's even worse here for their home race. 28 seconds off the pace, 20 seconds off the Eurobrunes. 2 laps, engine failure. So yeah, not improving at the ultimate power.
Wasn't Monza the round where they got the Judd engines?
It was the following round. At this point, they'd like,
Right,
no,
right.
we're calling it quits with this W12. This is not happening.
It couldn't fit, or they couldn't get it to work because they had a lot of trouble with Leighton House with that engine because they got the Judd from Leighton House, but there was back and forth going on because they were saying this engine's fine, isn't it? And they're like, yeah, no worries, it's all good. And then they got it and they found so many issues with it, and they tried to basically go after them, saying, "Oi, you gave us a lemon. You either rectify this or we're escalating this further." And I don't know whether that engine was meant to go into the car in Monza or Monza was the catalyst for them getting it, but you're saying that this didn't happen until after Monza? Am I right in saying that?
It did. It took 10 days for them to modify the car to actually be able to fit the engine, the Judd in, which they managed to get it to, and they saved a lot of weight because the car was now 80 kilograms lighter, so a whole person lighter. So that would have made a difference. So yes, but they took it to they took it to Estoril, and yeah, the engine cover just flew off on the outlap. And again, you think if it took you 10 days to modify it, you might think, okay, well, the most important part here is making sure the engine cover fits, and apparently it doesn't. So there are shots of it driving around with just no engine cover because it just blows off.
Verstappen in Monza moment.
And part of me is wondering how that happens because it's like, unless the exhaust is exhausting into the engine cover, it must just be the vibrations being so severe that would shake it off, but then it should be bolted down or that.
Yeah.
Not that you'd think there would have been much on a car like that.
There was still enough, I assume.
Yeah.
Because if you get the air underneath it and it's not properly latched on, it will just go. Rup.
Yeah, but the air they got is the air they've got, the engine they got was a very worn out, heavily used one. In the same way that the Andrea Moda, the Judd engines that Sassetti paid a couple of $100,000 for, he was obviously shortchanged because they basically never worked. And it's like, if you'd had new functioning Judds, they probably could have qualified for a lot more races. And with the Life, yeah, had it worked, there was potential, but it meant they didn't set a lap time there. And then they went to Spain at Jerez, and they did get a lap time, but it was 20 seconds off and 17 seconds off Eurobrune. So the Judd made no difference in the end, which was interesting.
And then that's when they called it quits, wasn't it?
Yeah, at that point they gave up, and it's like we're not doing it anymore because the thing is they only did 2 laps, and then that Judd died, and so it's like, yeah, I think the universe is telling you it's trying to send a message here, and that was that. Maybe if they'd had a new Judd that worked, it might have done better, but it seemed like it made no difference in the end.
Yeah, chassis was still fucked. So
yeah. It also meant, yeah, so that was that. So it meant, Giocamelli never raced in Formula One again. Franco Scapini, their test driver, they originally had tried to get him to replace Brabham, but he wasn't granted a super license. Probably because you needed to do X amount of testing mileage, and there was no possible way that car was going to get to that kind of mileage. And that was that. The car itself, it sat in a garage in Italy for like 30 years or more than 20 years, gathering dust, but then they managed to restore it and get it to run at the Goodwood Festival of Speed one year. And it sounds quite meaty actually when you hear the engine. And it'd be interesting to see it run properly again, to give it a proper test on a track just to see what it can do when the engine can run for more than 5 laps. But it's become one of those kind of curiosities from Formula One's past.
I think it's because I think it's because you'd never have a story like this nowadays at all ever. Like the field spread nowadays, there are races where, like in Q1, the slowest drivers are like 1.5 seconds behind the leaders. Like, considering with some of these gaps, 20 seconds, 30 seconds, you'd never see a story like this in F1. And I think that's why it's so interesting. It's the same with MasterCard Lola. It's the same with some of the other terrible teams, Token, Mackie, those other guys from 70s and the 80s. That's essentially why it's so interesting.
There was that fridge company as well that made a car. What was their name?
Fridge company, Fundamental.
Yeah, no. There was a team in the 70s that made fridges, and they were like, okay, let's build a Formula One car.
LET?
I think there were LET, maybe them. Yeah, you got ones like that. Politoys that normally made toy cars were like, let's build a real car. You just all this.
Protoss made that plywood car, even though it was an F2 car.
Yeah, the one made of wood. All of these different experiments. There was the one that was that Arzani Volpini in 1950 or 51 that had 80 horsepower as well, against the supercharged alphas that had about 450. But yeah, this one. I mean, people call it the worst F1 car of all time. And it's like, okay, pound for pound, it's one of the least competitive ever. But if you put it on a track against a car, it would probably still beat any car from the 1950s or 60s in terms of pure lap pace.
I think you'd have to go on percentages, to be honest. You'd have to go on percentages compared to the lead cars from a time.
And even then, it might even not be the worst because, I mean, okay, it's not technically a Formula One car, but the 1959 United States Grand Prix when
Roger Ward
entered a Curtis Craft midget car, which those things are designed for dirt tracks, and he was insistent that he was going to beat everyone in the corners. I think he knew that the engine, it was a 1.5 litre engine with a 2-speed transmission compared to 2.5 litre engines that had like 5-speed for the F1 cars, and his qualifying lap was over 40 seconds off the pace at Sebring. But that is not technically a Formula One car. But back then it was like there were no rules. You could enter just about anything. I mean, there were cars they had because there were other ones. I mean, Jack Brabham's debut was in a Cooper that had covered wheels, Streamliner, and I was like, that's just a Le Mans car. That's not a Formula One car. But this one was at least more or less fit within the rules. But it was also a small team because you think now Haas is on the smaller side of modern F1 teams, and they've got a staff of 200 or 300 compared to 1,000 for Mercedes and people like that. Life had a staff of 9. So yeah, they had the team manager Sergio Barbasio, the test driver, Franco Scapini test driver. Then they would have had obviously Brabham and then Giocamelli. Ernesto Vita's wife, Francesca Papa. I'm not sure what her role in this is because this is the day of transponders, so they don't use their girlfriends to like click the timer and do their lap times or whatever. Maurizio Ferrari, interesting name, engineer. Emilio Gabrielli was the truck mechanic, and then 3 mechanics: Olivier Piazzi, Heinz Willy-Muller, and Luca Cassoni. So yeah, only a small bunch, and only 3 or 4 of them are the ones actually the mechanics that actually build the car and make it run. So maybe makes it a tad more understandable. But then there were a lot of teams back then that had maybe only a couple of dozen people in them, but they could at least get the car to run enough laps to do a reasonably competitive lap time in pre-qualifying. We
can't add anything to what you're saying. It's just so empty.
Yeah, they're just a funny team to look at because it's like it's bad because Andrea Moda is bad because it was just operationally incompetent and kind of scandalous and really mistreating of drivers, even though the car itself was sort of okay. But with this, it was just the car being horrifically bad, but on another level compared to what Coloni and like Eurobrune and all the others were doing.
Yes.
But yeah, I don't think we'll see anything like that in the future, although I wouldn't mind a little bit more variation in the kind of engines that you could get. I think it would be quite interesting to have a mixture of like V8s and V10s and all of that back on the grid, rather than just having basically the same engines for everybody.
Maybe that'd stop Mercedes getting a 7-year advantage on everyone else.
Yeah, because then you can just do whatever you like. It would be, yeah, because we had this in the 90s, we had that mixture, and I think these days I wouldn't mind seeing more of that. But yeah, that's life in a nutshell.
Quite literally.
Yeah. Thank you, Josh, for joining us, and obviously everyone let us know in the comments your opinions on life, if you will. Yeah.
I already summed it up in my video enough. 2 words.
Go and watch that.
Life sucks.
Yes.
And also the Life F1 car was pretty bad.
Yes. You've been listening to the DRS Train podcast. We're on YouTube and Spotify, and you can find us on Instagram and X at the DRS Train podcast. Make sure to tune in for our next episode. Stay safe, and we'll see you all next time.
Bye.